Welcome back to Josh's Auto. Today I've got a 2009 Land Rover LR2. Needs an alternator. There weren't any videos that I could find of anybody showing how to do this easily. So to change the alternator, start by pulling the upper cover off. That right there is just on a couple little push buttons, so it just lifts straight off. And from what I have seen so far, you're going to need to disconnect this hose here, the fuel rail pressure sensor, the mass airflow sensor. I'm going to take the whole air box off with the intake. Then the intake has 7 bolts across the top to take it loose. Then there's actually 2 bolts I'll show you on the bottom, or do my best to show you on the bottom to take loose, to be able to remove the entire intake. On the throttle body side of the intake tube, it also has a clamp like this. If you choose to disconnect the intake tube from the throttle body, to go ahead and take the tube loose from the intake, to go ahead and remove it. I may end up just disconnecting it here. So let me go to the bottom and show you those 2 bolts. Alright, on the bottom side, there was a skid pan. It looks like it's originally supposed to have 6 bolts holding it on. They were 13mm on the head. This particular one was missing 2. Then if you look through here, you have a coolant hose. It's 8mm holding there and on this side. So I think I can get around without doing it. But if you look above the hose, there's 2 bolts in these rubber grommets that go to the intake. They are an 8mm. You can take both of them loose and you'll have the bottom of the intake loose. So I'm back on the top. I got those 2 bolts out on the bottom. As you can see, intake is loose. So I pulled the line off. That is actually a coolant line. I just found a little rubber cap, put it on the line to avoid losing so much coolant. And what I'm observing is that to actually have enough clearance for the intake to come up, the fuel rail is going to have to be unbolted. What I'm going to do is take all 3 of the bolts out. So those are 8mm. These upper intake bolts are 10mm on the head. And then I'm going to continue. Not sure where I left off, but you do in fact have to take the intake tube off to get this intake out. And to open up a little more space, I pulled the fan relay or resistor, whichever you want to call it. It bolts on to the shroud right in this area. It's 1 plug here, then 1 plug on the bottom side, and it was held in on this one with 1 single Phillips head screw to take it off. As you can see, everything is loose. From underneath, there's a plug on the actual throttle body to disconnect, and then on the passenger side of the intake, there's 1 more plug to disconnect. I can't see the sensor with the intake in, but it appears to be the map sensor, so you need to unplug that too. And then also on this driver's side, there is what appears to be a piece for the evaporative system that you have to unplug the 1 tube, then the other tube can push closer to the block up underneath the intake. Or I'm sorry, up underneath the alternator to gain more access. So as you can see, this thing is starting to really come up. And if that tube wasn't there, this intake would already be out. But unfortunately, that tube appears to be pressed into the cylinder head. So I'm gonna keep working to get this around, and once I find the answer to that, I will get back to you. Alright, have the intake out. So the piece I was talking about for the evap, it hooks on here. It's just the little squeeze plastic tabs to release it. It's kind of a pain in the neck. This was also the piece I was talking about pushing underneath the alternator. It turns out after you unhook it and unhook the electrical connector, you want to lay it closer to the throttle body. I had to take it loose off of this clip, so I had enough room to wiggle it free to release that line. So you may not need to, but that's how I did it. Then on the passenger side of the intake, this is on the radiator side, you also have these two sensors to unplug. Then it'll come out. Set that down. There you can see, we're finally down to the alternator. And the alternator attaches with a coupler there. So then it's a couple of bolts to unbolt the alternator. And you have your pigtail for the regulator, and your main battery wire. So the only video I found on this, the man literally just said that it's doable. If you do not have a lot of experience working on cars, I don't recommend trying to do this yourself. If you do have a lot of experience, expect this job to take several hours. I know the labor guide is like 3.2 to 3.5 hours to do the job. And I hope that helped somebody else. And if anybody else who works on these has any input on how to make this easier, please leave a comment below. Thank you. One more thing that I just found out is there's actually an Allen fitting in that tube, that coolant tube that I've been fighting around, and it does actually unscrew. So that should make life a lot easier. So I have my alternator loose now and pulled out. But something I realized is whenever I pulled it out, this is the cog that drives the alternator. This bolt was loose on the one I'm working on. So while you have the alternator out, just go ahead and verify that that is in fact tight. And it bolts up right there. So I'm going to make sure that that is nice and tight before I go ahead and bolt all of this back together. Sure would hate to have to tear all the way back into this to fix that at a later date. And it looks like there's timing marks on it. I mean, there's a white mark there, another mark there, but I don't see any marks on that side. So I'm not sure if the factory uses that to verify that it is in fact turning, or what in the world they use that for, because there's no keyway on it. And there's no specific orientation that I can tell on both the shaft or on that pulley. So, thanks for tuning in.